In the vast and melancholy plains of Little Russia, where the boundless steppe stretches beneath a sky heavy with ancient legends, there once wandered a young bursak of the Kiev Seminary, one Khoma Brut by name. Student of philosophy, though more given to the pleasures of the bottle and the reckless freedom of youth than to the grave pursuits of theology, he little suspected that fate would soon lead him into regions where the veil between the mortal world and the invisible realm grows perilously thin. Accompanied by two fellow students upon a journey through those remote districts, Khoma sought only the simple comforts of a wayside lodging. Yet it was his misfortune to seek shelter beneath the roof of an aged crone whose dwelling harbored secrets far older than the wooden icons that adorn the village churches. That night, beneath the indifferent stars, the hag cast off her mortal disguise and revealed herself as a witch of dreadful power. Mounting the hapless philosopher as though he were a steed, she bore him through the midnight air in a frenzied flight that blurred the boundary between dream and damnation. From this unholy ride sprang a summons more terrible still. In a distant hamlet, Khoma was commanded by the local sotnik to keep vigil for 3 nights over the body of his deceased daughter, a maiden of surpassing beauty, now laid in state within the lonely village church. What began as a sacred duty of prayer and lamentation soon unfolded into a trial of the soul. For with each passing midnight, the dead girl stirred, the shadows quickened with unclean spirits, and the air grew thick with the wings of infernal creatures. On the 3rd night, when the forces of darkness hold greatest sway, there came forth that which no living man should behold, the sovereign of the gnomes and lord of the subterranean hosts. Squat and hideous figure, his iron visage encrusted with the black earth of the grave, his form matted with coarse hair and trailing roots, he moved with ponderous dread. Most fearful of all were his eyelids, of prodigious length and weight, which hung down like heavy curtains of flesh and dragged upon the ground, concealing eyes whose gaze, once raised by his attendant imps, could pierce every charm and protection devised by man, consigning the unfortunate victim to a doom beyond the mercy of heaven. Thus, within the flickering light of waxen tapers and the sacred circle drawn upon the church floor, the young philosopher stood alone against the gathering legions of the night. Whether faith, courage, or the frail barrier of chalk could preserve him from the horrors that hungered for his spirit remains the burden of this singular tale. Such is the substance of the a work drawn from the rich and somber folklore of the Ukraine, wherein Nikolai Gogol has woven together the grotesque and the sublime, the sacred and the profane, to chilling and unforgettable effect. The VIY. The V is a monstrous creation of popular fancy. It is the name which the inhabitants of Little Russia give to the king of the gnomes, whose eyelashes reach to the ground. The following story is a specimen of such folklore. I have made no alterations, but reproduce it in the same simple form in which I heard it. Author's note. As soon as the clear seminary bell began sounding in Kiev in the morning, the pupils would come flocking from all parts of the town. The students of grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology hastened with their books under their arms over the streets. The grammarians were still mere boys. On the way, they pushed against each other and quarreled with shrill voices. Nearly all of them wore torn or dirty clothes, and their pockets were always crammed with all kinds of things: pushbones, pipes made out of pens, remains of confectionery, and sometimes even young sparrows. The latter would sometimes begin to chirp in the midst of deep silence in the school and bring down on their possessors severe canings and thrashings. The rhetoricians walked in a more orderly way. Their clothes were generally untorn, but on the other hand, their faces were often strangely decorated. One had a black eye, and the lips of another resembled a single blister, etc. These spoke to each other in tenor voices. The philosophers talked in a tone an octave lower. In their pockets, they only had fragments of tobacco, never whole cakes of it, for what they could get hold of, they used at once. They smelt so strongly of tobacco and brandy that a workman passing by them would often remain standing and sniffing with his nose in the air, like a hound. About this time of day, the marketplace was generally full of bustle, and the market women, selling rolls, cakes, and honey tarts, plucked the sleeves of those who wore coats of fine cloth or cotton. Young sir, here, here, they cried from all sides. Rolls and cakes and tasty tarts, very delicious. I have baked them myself. Another drew something long and crooked out of her basket and cried, Here is a sausage, young sir. Buy a sausage. Don't buy anything from her, cried a rival. See how greasy she is, and what a dirty nose and hands she has. But the market women carefully avoided appealing to the philosophers and theologians, for these only took handfuls of eatables merely to taste them. Arrived at the seminary, the whole crowd of students dispersed into the low, large classrooms with small windows broad doors, and blackened benches. Suddenly, they were filled with a many-toned murmur. The teachers heard the pupils' lessons repeated, some in shrill and others in deep voices which sounded like a distant booming. While the lessons were being said, the teachers kept a sharp eye open to see whether pieces of cake or other dainties were protruding from their pupils' pockets. If so, they were promptly confiscated. And this learned crowd arrived somewhat earlier than usual, or when it was known that the teachers would come somewhat late, a battle would ensue, as though planned by general agreement. In this battle, all had to take part, even the monitors who were appointed to look after the order and morality of the whole school. Two theologians generally arranged the conditions of the battle, whether each class should split into two sides or whether all the pupils should divide themselves into two halves. In each case, the grammarians began the battle, and after the rhetoricians had joined in, the former retired and stood on the benches in order to watch the fortunes of the fray. Then came the philosophers with long black moustaches, and finally the thick-necked theologians. The battle generally ended in a victory for the latter, and the philosophers retired to the different classrooms, rubbing their aching limbs and throwing themselves on the benches to take breath. When the teacher, who in his own time had taken part in such contests, entered the classroom, he saw by the heated faces of his pupils that the battle had been very severe, and while he caned the hands of the rhetoricians, in another room another teacher did the same for the philosophers. On Sundays and festival days, the seminarists took puppet theatres to the citizens' houses. Sometimes they acted a comedy, and in that case it was always a theologian who took the part of the hero or heroine, Potiphar or Herodias, etc. As a reward for their exertions, they received a piece of linen, a sack of maize, half a roast goose, or something similar. All the students, lay and clerical, were very poorly provided with means for procuring themselves necessary subsistence, but at the same time very fond of eating, so that, however much food was given to them, they were never satisfied, and the gifts bestowed by rich landowners were never adequate for their needs. Therefore the commissariat committee, consisting of philosophers and theologians, sometimes dispatched the grammarians and rhetoricians under the leadership of a philosopher, themselves sometimes joining in the expedition, with sacks on their shoulders, into the town, in order to levy a contribution on the fleshpots of the citizens, and then there was a feast in the seminary. Most important event in the seminary year was the arrival of the holidays. These began in July, and then generally all the students went home. At that time all the roads were thronged with grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians. He who had no home of his own would take up his quarters with some fellow student's family. The philosophers and theologians looked out for tutors' posts, taught the children of rich farmers, and received for doing so a pair of new boots, and sometimes also a new coat. A whole troop of them would go off in close ranks like a regiment. They cooked their porridge in common and encamped under the open sky. Each had a bag with him containing a shirt and a pair of socks. The theologians were especially economical. In order not to wear out their boots too quickly, they took them off and carried them on a stick over their shoulders, especially when the road was very muddy. Then they tucked up their breeches over their knees and waded bravely through the pools and puddles. Whenever they spied a village near the highway, they at once left it, approached the house, which seemed the most considerable, and began with loud voices to sing a psalm. Master of the house, an old Cossack engaged in agriculture, would listen for a long time with his head propped in his hands, then with tears on his cheeks say to his wife, "What the students are singing sounds very devout. Bring out some lard and anything else of the kind we have in the house." After thus replenishing their stores, the students would continue their way. The farther they went, the smaller grew their numbers, as they dispersed to their various houses and left those whose homes were still farther on. On one occasion, during such a march, 3 students left the main road in order to get provisions in some village, since their stock had long been exhausted. This party consisted of the theologian Carlava, the philosopher Thomas Brutus, and the rhetorician Tiberius Gorobits. The first was a tall youth with broad shoulders and of a peculiar character. Everything which came within reach of his fingers he felt obliged to appropriate. Moreover, he was of a very melancholy disposition, and when he had got intoxicated, he hid himself in the most tangled thickets, so that the seminary officials had the greatest trouble in finding him. The philosopher Thomas Brutus was a more cheerful character. He liked to lie for a long time on the same spot and smoke his pipe, and when he was merry with wine, he hired a fiddler and danced the tropak. Often he got a whole quantity of beans, i.e. thrashings, but these he endured with complete philosophic calm, saying that a man cannot escape his destiny. The rhetorician Tiberius Gorobits had not yet the right to wear a moustache, to drink brandy, or to smoke tobacco. He only wore a small crop of hair, as though his character was at present too little developed. To judge by the great bumps on his forehead, with which he often appeared in the classroom, it might be expected that some day he would be a valiant fighter. Carlava and Thomas often pulled his hair as a mark of their special favor and sent him on their errands. Evening had already come when they left the high road. The sun had just gone down, and the air was still heavy with the heat of the day. The theologian and the philosopher strolled along, smoking in silence, while the rhetorician struck off the heads of the thistles by the wayside with his stick. The way wound on through thick woods of oak and walnut. Green hills alternated here and there with meadows. Twice already they had seen cornfields, from which they concluded that they were near some village, but an hour had already passed, and no human habitation appeared. The sky was already quite dark, and only a red gleam lingered on the western horizon. "The deuce," said the philosopher Thomas Brutus. "I was almost certain we would soon reach a village." The theologian still remained silent, looked round him, then put his pipe again between his teeth, and all three continued their way. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the philosopher, and stood still. "Now the road itself is disappearing." "Perhaps we shall find a farm farther on," answered the theologian, without taking his pipe out of his mouth. Meanwhile the night had descended, clouds increased the darkness, and according to all appearance, there was no chance of moon or stars appearing. The seminarists found that they had lost the way altogether. After the philosopher had vainly sought for a footpath, he exclaimed, "Where have we got to?" The theologian thought for a while and said, "Yes, it is really dark." The rhetorician went on one side, lay on the ground, and groped for a path, but his hands encountered only foxholes. All around lay a huge steppe over which no one seemed to have passed. The wanderers made several efforts to get forward, but the landscape grew wilder and more inhospitable. The philosopher tried to shout, but his voice was lost in vacancy. No one answered. Only some moments later, they heard a faint groaning sound like the whimpering of a wolf. "Curse it all! What shall we do?" said the philosopher. "Why, just stop here and spend the night in the open air," answered the theologian. So saying, he felt in his pocket, brought out his timber and steel, and lit his pipe. But the philosopher could not agree with this proposal. He was not accustomed to sleep till he had first eaten 5 pounds of bread and 5 of dripping, and so he now felt an intolerable emptiness in his stomach. Besides, in spite of his cheerful temperament, he was a little afraid of the wolves. "No, Carlava," he said, "that won't do. To lie down like a dog and without any supper. Let us try once more. Perhaps we shall find a house and the consolation of having a glass of brandy to drink before going to sleep." The word brandy, the theologian spat on one side and said, "Yes, of course, we cannot remain all night in the open air." The students went on, and to their great joy they heard the barking of dogs in the distance. After listening a while to see from which direction the barking came, they went on their way with new courage, and soon espied a light. "A village, by heavens, a village!" exclaimed the philosopher. His supposition proved correct. They soon saw 2 or 3 houses built round a courtyard. Lights glimmered in the windows, and before the fence stood a number of trees. The students looked through the crevices of the gates and saw a courtyard in which stood a large number of roving tradesmen's carts. In the sky there were now fewer clouds, and here and there a star was visible. "See, brother," one of them said, "we must now cry halt. Cost what it may, we must find entrance and a night's lodging." The 3 students knocked together at the gate and cried, "Open." The door of one of the houses creaked on its hinges, and an old woman wrapped in a sheepskin appeared. "Who is there?" she exclaimed, coughing loudly. "Let us spend the night here, mother. We have lost our way, our stomachs are empty, and we do not want to spend the night out of doors." "But what sort of people are you?" "Quite harmless people, the theologian Carlava, the philosopher Brutus, and the rhetorician Gorobits." "It is impossible," answered the old woman. "The whole house is full of people, and every corner occupied. Where can I put you up? You are big and heavy enough to break the house down. I know these philosophers and theologians. When once one takes them in, they eat one out of house and home. Go farther on. There is no room here for you. Have pity on us, mother. How can you be so heartless? Don't let Christians perish. Put us up where you like, and if we eat up your provisions or do any other damage, may our hands wither up and all the punishment of heaven light on us." The old woman seemed a little touched. "Well," she said after a few moments' consideration, "I will let you in, but I must put you in different rooms, for I should have no quiet if you were all together at night." "Do just as you like, we won't say any more about it," answered the students. The gates moved heavily on their hinges, and they entered the courtyard. "Well now, mother," said the philosopher, following the old woman, "if you had a little scrap of something." By heavens, my stomach is as empty as a drum. I have not had a bit of bread in my mouth since early this morning." "Didn't I say so?" replied the old woman. "There you go begging at once. But I have no food in the house, nor any fire." "But we will pay for everything," continued the philosopher. "We will pay early tomorrow in cash. Go on and be content with what you get. You are fine fellows whom the devil has brought here." A reply greatly depressed the philosopher Thomas, but suddenly his nose caught the odor of dried fish. He looked at the breeches of the theologian who walked by his side and saw a huge fish's tail sticking out of his pocket. The latter had already seized the opportunity to steal a whole fish from one of the carts standing in the courtyard. He had not done this from hunger so much as from the force of habit. He had quite forgotten the fish and was looking about to see whether he could not find something else to appropriate. Then the philosopher put his hand in the theologian's pocket as though it were his own and laid hold of his prize. The old woman found a special resting place for each student. The rhetorician she put in a shed, the theologian in an empty storeroom, and the philosopher in a sheep's stall. As soon as the philosopher was alone, he devoured the fish in a twinkling, examined the fence which enclosed the stall, kicked away a pig from a neighboring stall, which had inquiringly inserted its nose through a crevice, and lay down on his right side to sleep like a corpse. Then the low door opened, and the old woman came crouching into the stall. "Well, mother, what do you want here?" asked the philosopher. She made no answer, but came with outstretched arms towards him. The philosopher shrank back, but she still approached, as though she wished to lay hold of him. Terrible fright seized him, for he saw the old hag's eyes sparkle in an extraordinary way. "Away with you, old witch, away with you," he shouted. But she still stretched her hands after him. He jumped up in order to rush out, but she placed herself before the door, fixed her glowing eyes upon him, and again approached him. The philosopher tried to push her away with his hands, but to his astonishment, he found that he could neither lift his hands nor move his legs, nor utter an audible word. He only heard his heart beating and saw the old woman approach him, place his hands crosswise on his breast, and bend his head down. Then with the agility of a cat she sprang on his shoulders, struck him on the side with a broom, and he began to run like a race horse, carrying her on his shoulders. All this happened with such swiftness that the philosopher could scarcely collect his thoughts. He laid hold of his knees with both hands in order to stop his legs from running, but to his great astonishment they kept moving forward against his will, making rapid springs like a Caucasian horse. Not till the house had been left behind them and a wide plain stretched before them, bordered on one side by a black gloomy wood, did he say to himself, "Ah, it is a witch." The half-moon shone pale and high in the sky. Its mild light, still more subdued by intervening clouds, fell like a transparent veil on the earth. Woods, meadows, hills, and valleys all seemed to be sleeping with open eyes. Nowhere was a breath of air stirring. The atmosphere was moist and warm. The shadows of the trees and bushes fell sharply defined on the sloping plain. Such was the night through which the philosopher Thomas Brutus sped with his strange rider. A strange, oppressive, and yet sweet sensation took possession of his heart. He looked down and saw how the grass beneath his feet seemed to be quite deep and far away. Over it there flowed a flood of crystal-clear water, and the grassy plain looked like the bottom of a transparent sea. He saw his own image, and that of the old woman whom he carried on his back, clearly reflected in it. And he beheld how, instead of the moon, a strange sun shone there. He heard the deep tones of bells and saw them swinging. He saw a water nixie rise from a bed of tall reeds. She turned to him, and her face was clearly visible, and she sang a song which penetrated his soul. Then she approached him and nearly reached the surface of the water, on which she burst into laughter and again disappeared. Did he see it, or did he not see it? Was he dreaming, or was he awake? But what was that below, wind or music? It sounded and drew nearer, and penetrated his soul like a song that rose and fell. What is it? He thought as he gazed into the depths, and still sped rapidly along. The perspiration flowed from him in streams. He experienced simultaneously a strange feeling of oppression and delight in all his being. Often he felt as though he had no longer a heart, and pressed his hand on his breast with alarm. Weary to death, he began to repeat all the prayers which he knew, and all the formulas of exorcism against evil spirits. Suddenly he experienced a certain relief. He felt that his pace was slackening, the witch weighed less heavily on his shoulders, and the thick herbage of the plain was again beneath his feet, with nothing especial to remark about it. Splendid, thought the philosopher Thomas, and began to repeat his exorcisms in a still louder voice. Then suddenly he wrenched himself away from under the witch, and sprang on her back in his turn. She began to run, with short, trembling steps indeed, but so rapidly that he could hardly breathe. So swiftly did she run that she hardly seemed to touch the ground. They were still on the plain, but owing to the rapidity of their flight, everything seemed indistinct and confused before his eyes. He seized a stick that was lying on the ground and began to belabor the hag with all his might. She uttered a wild cry, which at first sounded raging and threatening. Then it became gradually weaker and more gentle, till at last it sounded quite low, like the pleasant tones of a silver bell, so that it penetrated his innermost soul. Involuntarily, the thought passed through his mind. Is she really an old woman? Oh, I can go no farther, she said in a faint voice, and sank to the earth. He knelt beside her and looked in her eyes. The dawn was red in the sky, and in the distance glimmered the gilt domes of the churches of Kiev. Before him lay a beautiful maiden with thick, disheveled hair and long eyelashes. Unconsciously she had stretched out her white, bare arms, and her tear-filled eyes gazed at the sky. Thomas trembled like an aspen leaf. Sympathy and a strange feeling of excitement and a hitherto unknown fear overpowered him. He began to run with all his might. His heart beat violently, and he could not explain to himself what a strange, new feeling had seized him. He did not wish to return to the village, but hastened towards Kiev, thinking all the way as he went of his weird, unaccountable adventure. There were hardly any students left in the town. They were all scattered about the country and had either taken tutors' posts or simply lived without occupation, for at the farms in Little Russia one can live comfortably and at ease without paying a farthing. The great half-decayed building in which the seminary was established was completely empty, and however much the philosopher searched in all its corners for a piece of lard and bread, he could not find even one of the hard biscuits which the seminarists were in the habit of hiding. The philosopher found a means of extricating himself from his difficulties by making friends with a certain young widow in the marketplace who sold ribbons, etc. The same evening, he found himself being stuffed with cakes and fowl. In fact, it is impossible to say how many things were placed before him on a little table in an arbor shaded by cherry trees. Later on the same evening, the philosopher was to be seen in an ale-house. He lay on a bench, smoked his pipe in his usual way, and threw the Jewish publican a gold piece. He had a jug of ale standing before him, looked on all who went in and out in a cold-blooded, self-satisfied way, and thought no more of his strange adventure. About this time, a report spread about that the daughter of a rich colonel, whose estate lay about 50 versts distant from Kiev, had returned home one day from a walk in a quite broken-down condition. He had scarcely enough strength to reach her father's house. Now she lay dying and had expressed a wish that for 3 days after her death, the prayers for the dead should be recited by a Kiev seminarist named Thomas Brutus. This fact was communicated to the philosopher by the rector of the seminary himself, who sent for him to his room and told him that he must start at once, as a rich colonel had sent his servants and a kibitka for him. The philosopher trembled and was seized by an uncomfortable feeling which he could not define. He had a gloomy foreboding that some evil was about to befall him. Without knowing why, he declared that he did not wish to go. "Listen, Thomas," said the rector, who under certain circumstances spoke very politely to his pupils, "I have no idea of asking you whether you wish to go or not. I only tell you that if you think of disobeying, I will have you so soundly flogged on the back with young birchrods that you need not think of having a bath for a long time." The philosopher scratched the back of his head and went out silently, intending to make himself scarce at the first opportunity. Lost in thought, he descended the steep flight of steps which led to the courtyard, thickly planted with poplars. There he remained standing for a moment, and heard quite distinctly the rector giving orders in a loud voice to his steward, and to another person, probably one of the messengers sent by the colonel. "Thank your master for the peeled barley and the eggs," said the rector, "and tell him that as soon as the books which he mentions in his note are ready, I will send them. I have already given them to a clerk to be copied. And don't forget to remind your master that he has some excellent fish, especially prime sturgeon, in his ponds. He might send me some when he has the opportunity, as here in the market the fish are bad and dear. And you, Jantuk, give the colonel's man a glass of brandy. And mind you tie up the philosopher, or he will show you a clean pair of heels." "Listen to the scoundrel," thought the philosopher. "He has smelt a rat, the long-legged stork." He descended into the courtyard and beheld there a kibitka, which he at first took for a barn on wheels. It was, in fact, as roomy as a kiln, so that bricks might have been made inside it. It was one of those remarkable Krakow vehicles in which Jews traveled from town to town in scores, wherever they thought they would find a market. 6 stout, strong, though somewhat elderly Cossacks were standing by it. Their gold-braided coats of fine cloth showed that their master was rich and of some importance, and certain little scars testified to their valor on the battlefield. "What can I do?" thought the philosopher. "There is no escaping one's destiny." So he stepped up to the Cossacks and said, "Good day, comrades." "Welcome, Mr. Philosopher," some of them answered. "Well, I am to travel with you." "It is a magnificent vehicle," he continued as he got into it. "If there were only musicians present, one might dance in it." "Yes, it is a roomy carriage," said one of the Cossacks, taking his seat by the coachman. The latter had tied a cloth round his head, as he had already found an opportunity of pawning his cap in the alehouse. The other 5, with the philosopher, got into the capacious kibitka and sat upon sacks which were filled with all sorts of articles purchased in the city. "I should like to know," said the philosopher, "if this equipage were laden with salt or iron, how many horses would be required to draw it?" "Yes," said the Cossack who sat by the coachman, after thinking a short time, "it would require a good many horses." After giving this satisfactory answer, the Cossack considered himself entitled to remain silent for the whole of the rest of the journey. The philosopher would gladly have found out who the colonel was and what sort of a character he had. He was also curious to know about his daughter, who had returned home in such a strange way and now lay dying, and whose destiny seemed to be mingled with his own, and wanted to know the sort of life that was lived in the colonel's house. But the Cossacks were probably philosophers like himself, for in answer to his inquiries, they only blew clouds of tobacco and settled themselves more comfortably on their sacks. Meanwhile, one of them addressed to the coachman on the box a brief command: "Keep your eyes open, Overco, you old sleepyhead, and when you come to the alehouse on the road to Tchakrilov, don't forget to pull up and wake me and the other fellows if we are asleep." Then he began to snore pretty loud. But in any case, his admonition was quite superfluous, for scarcely had the enormous equipage begun to approach the aforesaid alehouse than they all cried with one mouth, "Halt! Halt!" Besides this, Overco's horse was accustomed to stop outside every inn of its own accord. In spite of the intense July heat, they all got out and entered a low, dirty room where a Jewish innkeeper received them in a friendly way as old acquaintances. He brought in the skirt of his long coat some sausages and laid them on the table where, though forbidden by the Talmud, they looked very seductive. All sat down at table, and it was not long before each of the guests had an earthenware jug standing in front of him. The philosopher Thomas had to take part in the feast, and as the little Russians, when they are intoxicated, always begin to kiss each other or to weep, the whole room soon began to echo with demonstrations of affection. Come here, Spirid, let me embrace thee. Come here, Dorosh, let me press you to my heart." One Cossack with a grey moustache, the eldest of them all, leant his head on his hand and began to weep bitterly because he was an orphan and alone in God's wide world. Another tall, loquacious man did his best to comfort him, saying, "Don't weep, for God's sake, don't weep. For over there, God knows best." The Cossack who had been addressed as Dorosh was full of curiosity and addressed many questions to the philosopher Thomas. "I should like to know," he said, "what you learn in your seminary. Do you learn the same things as the deacon reads to us in church or something else?" "Don't ask," said the consoler, "let them learn what they like. God knows what is to happen, God knows everything." "No, I will know," answered Dorosh. "I will know what is written in their books. Perhaps it is something quite different from that in the deacon's book." "Oh, good heavens," said the other, "why all this talk? It is God's will, and one cannot change God's arrangements. But I will know everything that is written. I will enter the seminary too, by heaven I will. Do you think perhaps I could not learn? I will learn everything, everything." "Oh heavens," exclaimed the consoler, and let his head sink on the table, for he could no longer hold it upright. The other Cossacks talked about the nobility and why there was a moon in the sky. When the philosopher Thomas saw the state they were in, he determined to profit by it and to make his escape. In the first place, he turned to the grey-headed Cossack, who was lamenting the loss of his parents. "But little uncle," he said to him, "why do you weep so? I too am an orphan. Let me go, children, why do you want me?" "Let him go," said some of them. "He is an orphan, let him go where he likes." They were about to take him outside themselves, when the one who had displayed a special thirst for knowledge stopped them, saying, "No, I want to talk with him about the seminary. I am going to the seminary myself." Moreover, it was not yet certain whether the philosopher could have executed his project of flight, for when he tried to rise from his chair, he felt as though his feet were made of wood, and he began to see such a number of doors leading out of the room that it would have been difficult for him to have found the right one. It was not till evening that the company remembered that they must continue their journey. They crowded into the kibitka, whipped up the horses, and struck up a song, the words and sense of which were hard to understand. During a great part of the night, they wandered about, having lost the road which they ought to have been able to find blindfolded. Last they drove down a steep descent into a valley, and the philosopher noticed, by the sides of the road, hedges, behind which he caught glimpses of small trees and house roofs. All these belonged to the colonel's estate. It was already long past midnight. The sky was dark, though little stars glimmered here and there. No light was to be seen in any of the houses. They drove into a large courtyard, while the dogs barked. On all sides were barns and cottages with thatch roofs. Just opposite the gateway was a house, which was larger than the others and seemed to be the colonel's dwelling. The kibitka stopped before a small barn, and the travelers hastened into it and laid themselves down to sleep. The philosopher, however, attempted to look at the exterior of the house, but rub his eyes as he might, he could distinguish nothing. The house seemed to turn into a bear, and the chimney into the rector of the seminary. Then he gave it up and lay down to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, the whole house was in commotion. The young lady had died during the night. Servants ran hither and thither in a distracted state. The old women wept and lamented, and a number of curious people gazed through the enclosure into the courtyard, as though there was something special to be seen. The philosopher began now to inspect the locality and the buildings, which he had not been able to do during the night. The colonel's house was one of those low, small buildings, such as used formerly to be constructed in Russia. It was thatched with straw. A small, high-peaked gable, with a window shaped like an eye, was painted all over with blue and yellow flowers and red crescent moons. It rested on little oaken pillars, which were round above the middle, hexagonal below, and whose capitals were adorned with quaint carvings. Under this gable was a small staircase, with seats at the foot of it on either side. The walls of the house were supported by similar pillars. Before the house stood a large pear tree of pyramidal shape, whose leaves incessantly trembled. A double row of buildings formed a broad street leading up to the colonel's house. Behind the barns, near the entrance gate, stood two three-cornered winehouses, also thatched with straw. Each of the stone walls had a door in it, and was covered with all kinds of paintings. On one was represented a Cossack sitting on a barrel and swinging a large pitcher over his head. It bore the inscription, "I will drink all that." Elsewhere were painted large and small bottles, a beautiful girl, a running horse, a pipe, and a drum bearing the words, "Wine is the Cossack's joy." In the loft of one of the barns, one saw through a huge round window a drum and some trumpets. At the gate there stood two cannons. All this showed that the colonel loved a cheerful life, and the whole place often rang with sounds of merriment. Before the gate were two windmills, and behind the house gardens sloped away. Through the treetops, the dark chimneys of the peasants' houses were visible. The whole village lay on a broad, even plateau, in the middle of a mountain slope, which culminated in a steep summit on the north side. When seen from below, it looked still steeper. Here and there on the top, the irregular stems of the thick steppe brooms showed in dark relief against the blue sky. The bare clay soil made a melancholy impression, worn as it was into deep furrows by rainwater. On the same slope there stood two cottages, and over one of them a huge apple tree spread its branches. The roots were supported by small props, whose interstices were filled with mold. The apples, which were blown off by the wind, rolled down to the courtyard below. A road wound round the mountain to the village. When the philosopher looked at this steep slope, and remembered his journey of the night before, he came to the conclusion that either the colonel's horses were very sagacious, or that the Cossacks must have very strong heads, as they ventured, even when the worse for drink, on such a road with the huge kibitka. When the philosopher turned and looked in the opposite direction, he saw quite another picture. The village reached down to the plain. Meadows stretched away to an immense distance, their bright green growing gradually dark. Far away, about 20 versts off, many other villages were visible. To the right of these meadows were chains of hills, and in the remote distance one saw the Dnieper shimmer and sparkle like a mirror of steel. "What a splendid country," said the philosopher to himself. "It must be fine to live here. One could catch fish in the Dnieper and in the ponds, and shoot and snare partridges and bustards. There must be quantities here. Much fruit might be dried here and sold in the town, or better still, brandy might be distilled from it, for fruit brandy is the best of all. What prevents me thinking of my escape after all?" Behind the hedge he saw a little path, which was almost entirely concealed by the high grass of the steppe. The philosopher approached it mechanically, meaning at first to walk a little along it unobserved, and then quite quietly to gain the open country behind the peasants' houses. Suddenly he felt the pressure of a fairly heavy hand on his shoulder. Behind him stood the same old Cossack who yesterday had so bitterly lamented the death of his father and mother, and his own loneliness. "You are giving yourself useless trouble, Mr. Philosopher, if you think you can escape from us," he said. "One cannot run away here, and besides, the roads are too bad for walkers. Come to the colonel, he has been waiting for you for some time in his room." "Yes, of course. What are you talking about?" "I will come with the greatest pleasure," said the philosopher, and followed the Cossack. The colonel was an elderly man, his moustache was grey, and his face wore the signs of deep sadness. He sat in his room by a table, with his head propped on both hands. He seemed about 55, but his attitude of utter despair and the pallor on his face showed that his heart had been suddenly broken and that all his former cheerfulness had forever disappeared. When Thomas entered with the Cossack, he answered their deep bows with a slight inclination of the head. "Who are you, whence do you come, and what is your profession, my good man?" asked the colonel in an even voice, neither friendly nor austere. "I am a student of philosophy. My name is Thomas Brutus." "And who was your father?" "I don't know, sir." "And your mother?" "I don't know either. I know that I must have had a mother, but who she was, and where she lived, by heavens, I do not know." The colonel was silent, and seemed for a moment lost in thought. "Where did you come to know my daughter?" "I do not know her, gracious sir. I declare I do not know her." "Why then has she chosen you, and no one else, to offer up prayers for her?" The philosopher shrugged his shoulders. "God only knows. 'Tis a well-known fact that grand people often demand things which the most learned man cannot comprehend, and does not the proverb say, 'Dance, devil, as the Lord commands'?" "Aren't you talking nonsense, Mr. Philosopher? May the lightning strike me on the spot if I lie." "If she had only lived a moment longer," said the colonel sadly, "then I had certainly found out everything. She said, 'Let no one offer up prayers for me, but send, Father, at once to the seminary in Kiev for the student Thomas Brutus. He shall pray 3 nights running for my sinful soul, he knows.' But what he really knows, she never said." The poor dove could speak no more, and died. "Good man, you are probably well known for your sanctity and devout life, and she has perhaps heard of you." "What? Of me?" said the philosopher, and took a step backward in amazement. "In sanctity," he exclaimed, and stared at the colonel. "God help us, gracious sir. What are you saying?" "It was only last Holy Thursday that I paid a visit to the tart shop." "Well, she must at any rate have had some reason for making the arrangement, and you must begin your duties today. I should like to remark to your honor, naturally everyone who knows the Holy Scripture at all can in his measure, but I believe it would be better on this occasion to send for a deacon or subdeacon. They are learned people, and they know exactly what is to be done. I have not got a good voice, nor any official standing. You may say what you like, but I shall carry out all my dove's wishes. If you read the prayers for her 3 nights through in the proper way, I will reward you, and if not, I advise the devil himself not to oppose me." The colonel spoke the last words in such an emphatic way that the philosopher quite understood them. "Follow me," said the colonel. They went into the hall. The colonel opened a door which was opposite his own. The philosopher remained for a few minutes in the hall in order to look about him. Then he stepped over the threshold with a certain nervousness. The whole floor of the room was covered with red cloth. In a corner under the icons of the saints, on a table covered with a gold-bordered velvet cloth, lay the body of the girl. Tall candles, round which were wound branches of the kalina, stood at her head and feet and burned dimly in the broad daylight. The face of the dead was not to be seen, as the inconsolable father sat before his daughter, with his back turned to the philosopher. The words which the latter overheard filled him with a certain fear. "I do not mourn, my daughter, that in the flower of your age you have prematurely left the earth, to my grief, but I mourn, my dove, that I do not know my deadly enemy who caused your death. Had I only known that anyone could even conceive the idea of insulting you, or of speaking a disrespectful word to you, I swear by heaven he would never have seen his children again if he had been as old as myself, nor his father and mother if he had been young. And I would have thrown his corpse to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the steppe. But woe is me, my flower, my dove, my light. I will spend the remainder of my life without joy, and wipe the bitter tears which flow out of my old eyes, while my enemy will rejoice and laugh in secret over the helpless old man." He paused, overpowered by grief, and streams of tears flowed down his cheeks. The philosopher was deeply affected by the sight of such inconsolable sorrow. He coughed gently in order to clear his throat. The colonel turned and signed to him to take his place at the head of the dead girl before a little prayer desk on which some books lay. "I can manage to hold out for 3 nights, thought the philosopher, and then the colonel will fill both my pockets with ducats." He approached the dead girl, and after coughing once more, began to read, without paying attention to anything else, and firmly resolved not to look at her face. Soon there was deep silence, and he saw that the colonel had left the room. Slowly he turned his head in order to look at the corpse. A violent shudder thrilled through him. Before him lay a form of such beauty as is seldom seen upon earth. It seemed to him that never in a single face had so much intensity of expression and harmony of feature been united. A brow soft as snow and pure as silver seemed to be thinking. The fine, regular eyebrows shadowed proudly the closed eyes, whose lashes gently rested on her cheeks, which seemed to glow with secret longing. Her lips still appeared to smile. But at the same time, he saw something in these features which appalled him. A terrible depression seized his heart, as when in the midst of dance and song someone begins to chant a dirge. He felt as though those ruby lips were colored with his own heart's blood. Moreover, her face seemed dreadfully familiar. "The witch," he cried out in a voice which sounded strange to himself. Then he turned away and began to read the prayers with white cheeks. It was the witch whom he had killed. When the sun had sunk below the horizon, the corpse was carried into the church. The philosopher supported one corner of the black-draped coffin upon his shoulder and felt an ice-cold shiver run through his body. The colonel walked in front of him, with his right hand resting on the edge of the coffin. A wooden church, black with age and overgrown with green lichen, stood quite at the end of the village in gloomy solitude. It was adorned with 3 round cupolas. One saw at the first glance that it had not been used for divine worship for a long time. Lighted candles were standing before almost every icon. The coffin was set down before the altar. The old colonel kissed his dead daughter once more and then left the church, together with the bearers of the bier, after he had ordered his servants to look after the philosopher and to take him back to the church after supper. The coffin bearers, when they returned to the house, all laid their hands on the stove. This custom is always observed in Little Russia by those who have seen a corpse. The hunger which the philosopher now began to feel caused him for a while to forget the dead girl altogether. Gradually all the domestics of the house assembled in the kitchen. It was really a kind of club where they were accustomed to gather. Even the dogs came to the door, wagging their tails in order to have bones and offal thrown to them. If a servant was sent on an errand, he always found his way into the kitchen to rest there for a while and to smoke a pipe. All the Cossacks of the establishment lay here during the whole day on and under the benches, in fact, wherever a place could be found to lie down in. Moreover, everyone was always leaving something behind in the kitchen, his cap or his whip or something of the sort. But the numbers of the club were not complete till the evening, when the groom came in after tying up his horses in the stable. The cowherd had shut up his cows in their stalls, and others collected there who were not usually seen in the daytime. During supper time, even the tongues of the laziest were set in motion. They talked of all and everything, of the new pair of breeches which someone had ordered for himself, of what might be in the center of the earth, and of the wolf which someone had seen. There were a number of wits in the company, a class which is always represented in Little Russia. The philosopher took his place with the rest in the great circle which sat round the kitchen door in the open air. Soon an old woman with a red cap issued from it, bearing with both hands a large vessel full of hot galachkis, which she distributed among them. Each drew out of his pocket a wooden spoon or a one-pronged wooden fork. As soon as their jaws began to move a little more slowly and their wolfish hunger was somewhat appeased, they began to talk. The conversation, as might be expected, turned on the dead girl. "Is it true," said a young shepherd, "is it true, though I cannot understand it, that our young mistress had traffic with evil spirits?" "Who, the young lady?" answered Dorosh, whose acquaintance the philosopher had already made in the kibitka. "Yes, she was a regular witch. I can swear that she was a witch." "Hold your tongue, Dorosh," exclaimed another, the one who, during the journey, had played the part of a consoler. "We have nothing to do with that. May God be merciful to her. One ought not to talk of such things." But Dorosh was not at all inclined to be silent. He had just visited the wine cellar with the steward on important business, and having stooped 2 or 3 times over 1 or 2 casks, he had returned in a very cheerful and loquacious mood. "Why do you ask me to be silent?" he answered. "She has ridden on my own shoulders, I swear she has." "Say, uncle," asked the young shepherd, "are there signs by which to recognize a sorceress?" "No, there are not," answered Dorosh. "Even if you knew the Psalter by heart, you could not recognize one." "Yes, Dorosh, it is possible. Don't talk such nonsense," retorted the former consoler. "'Tis not for nothing that God has given each some special peculiarity. The learned maintain that every witch has a little tale." "Every old woman is a witch," said a grey-headed Cossack quite seriously. "Yes, you are a fine lot. retorted the old woman who entered at that moment with a vessel full of fresh galachkis. You are great fat pigs. A self-satisfied smile played round the lips of the old Cossack, whose name was Javtuch, when he found that his remark had touched the old woman on a tender point. The shepherd burst into such a deep and loud explosion of laughter as if two oxen were lowing together. This conversation excited in the philosopher a great curiosity and a wish to obtain more exact information regarding the colonel's daughter. In order to lead the talk back to the subject, he turned to his next neighbor and said, I should like to know why all the people here think that the young lady was a witch. Has she done harm to anyone or killed them by witchcraft? Yes, there are reports of that kind, answered a man whose face was as flat as a shovel. Who does not remember the huntsman Mikita, or the... What has the huntsman Mikita got to do with it? Asked the philosopher. Stop, I will tell you the story of Mikita, interrupted Dorosh. No, I will tell it, said the groom, for he was my godfather. I will tell the story of Mikita, said Spirid. Yes, yes, Spirid shall tell it, exclaimed the whole company, and Spirid began. You, Mr. Philosopher Thomas, did not know Mikita. Ah, he was an extraordinary man. He knew every dog as though he were his own father. The present huntsman, Mikola, who sits 3 places away from me, is not fit to hold a candle to him, though good enough in his way, but compared to Mikita, he is a mere milksop. You tell the tale splendidly, exclaimed Dorosh, and nodded as a sign of approval. Spirid continued. He saw a hare in the field quicker than you can take a pinch of snuff. He only needed to whistle, Come here, Raspa. Come here, Bestraja, and flew away on his horse like the wind, so that you could not say whether he went quicker than the dog or the dog than he. He could empty a quart pot of brandy in the twinkling of an eye. Ah, he was a splendid huntsman, only for some time he always had his eyes fixed on the young lady. Either he had fallen in love with her or she had bewitched him. In short, he went to the dogs. He became a regular old woman. Yes, he became the devil knows what. It is not fitting to relate it. Very good, remarked Dorosh. If the young lady only looked at him, he let the reins slip out of his hands, called Bravko instead of Raspe, stumbled, and made all kinds of mistakes. One day when he was currycombing a horse, the young lady came to him in the stable. Listen, Mikita, she said. I should like for once to set my foot on you. And he, the booby, was quite delighted, and answered, Don't only set your foot there, but sit on me altogether. The young lady lifted her white little foot, and as soon as he saw it, his delight robbed him of his senses. He bowed his neck, the idiot, took her feet in both hands, and began to trot about like a horse all over the place. Whither they went he could not say. He returned more dead than alive, and from that time he wasted away and became as dry as a chip of wood. At last someone coming into the stable one day found instead of him only a handful of ashes and an empty jug. He had burned completely out. But it must be said, he was a huntsman such as the world cannot match. And Spirid had ended his tale. They all began to vie with one another in praising the deceased huntsman. And have you heard the story of Chepchicha? Asked Dorosh, turning to Thomas. No. Hers. One sees they don't teach you much in your seminary. Well, listen. We have here in our village a Cossack called Chepton, a fine fellow. Sometimes, indeed, he amuses himself by stealing and lying without any reason, but he is a fine fellow for all that. His house is not far away from here. One evening, just about this time, Chepton and his wife went to bed after they had finished their day's work. Since it was fine weather, Chepchicha went to sleep in the courtyard and Chepton in the house. No. I mean Chepchicha went to sleep in the house on a bench and Chepton outside. No, Chepchicha didn't go to sleep on a bench, but on the ground, interrupted the old woman who stood at the door. Dorosh looked at her, then at the ground, then again at her, and said after a pause, If I tore your dress off your back before all these people, it wouldn't look pretty. The rebuke was effectual. The old woman was silent and did not interrupt again. Dorosh continued. In the cradle, which hung in the middle of the room, lay a 1-year-old child. I do not know whether it was a boy or a girl. Chepchicha had lain down and heard on the other side of the door a dog scratching and howling loud enough to frighten anyone. She was afraid, for women are such simple folk, that if one puts out one's tongue at them behind the door in the dark, their hearts sink into their boots. But she thought to herself, I must give this cursed dog one on the snout to stop his howling. So she seized the poker and opened the door. But hardly had she done so than the dog rushed between her legs straight to the cradle. Then Chepchicha saw that it was not a dog, but the young lady, and if it had only been the young lady as she knew her, it wouldn't have mattered, but she looked quite blue, and her eyes sparkled like fiery coals. He seized the child, bit its throat, and began to suck its blood. Chepchicha shrieked, "Ah, my darling child," and rushed out of the room. Then she saw that the house door was shut and rushed up to the attic and sat there, the stupid woman, trembling all over. Then the young lady came after her and bit her too, poor fool. The next morning Cheptown carried his wife, all bitten and wounded, down from the attic, and the next day she died. Such strange things happen in the world. One may wear fine clothes, but that does not matter. A witch is and remains a witch. After telling his story, Dorosh looked around him with a complacent air and cleaned out his pipe with his little finger in order to fill it again. The story of the witch had made a deep impression on all, and each of them had something to say about her. One had seen her come to the door of his house in the form of a herrick. From others, she had stolen their caps or their pipes. She had cut off the hairplaits of many girls in the village and drunk whole pints of the blood of others. At last the whole company observed that they had gossiped over their time, for it was already night. All looked for a sleeping place, some in the kitchen and others in the barn or the courtyard. "Now, Mr. Thomas, it is time that we go to the dead," said the grey-headed Cossack, turning to the philosopher. All four, Spirid, Dorosh, the old Cossack, and the philosopher, betook themselves to the church, keeping off with their whips the wild dogs who roamed about the roads in great numbers and bit the sticks of passers-by in sheer malice. Although the philosopher had seized the opportunity of fortifying himself beforehand with a stiff glass of brandy, yet he felt a certain secret fear which increased as he approached the church, which was lit up within. The strange tales he had heard had made a deep impression on his imagination. They had passed the thick hedges and trees, and the country became more open. At last they reached the small enclosure round the church. Behind it there were no more trees, but a huge, empty plain dimly visible in the darkness. The three Cossacks ascended the steep steps with Thomas and entered the church. Here they left the philosopher, expressing their hope that he would successfully accomplish his duties, and locked him in as their master had ordered. He was left alone. At first he yawned, then he stretched himself, blew on both hands, and finally looked round him. In the middle of the church stood the black bier. Before the dark pictures of saints burned the candles, whose light only illuminated the icons and cast a faint glimmer into the body of the church. All the corners were in complete darkness. The lofty icons seemed to be of considerable age. Only a little of the original gilt remained on their broken traceries. The faces of the saints had become quite black and looked uncanny. Once more the philosopher cast a glance around him. "Bother it," said he to himself. "What is there to be afraid about? No living creature can get in, and as for the dead and those who come from the other side, I can protect myself with such effectual prayers that they cannot touch me with the tips of their fingers. There is nothing to fear," he repeated, swinging his arms. "Let us begin the prayers." As he approached one of the side aisles, he noticed 2 packets of candles which had been placed there. "That is fine," he thought. "I must illuminate the whole church till it is as bright as day. What a pity that one cannot smoke in it." He began to light the candles on all the wall brackets and all the candelabra, as well as those already burning before the holy pictures. Soon the whole church was brilliantly lit up. Only the darkness in the roof above seemed still denser by contrast, and the faces of the saints peering out of the frames looked as unearthly as before. He approached the bier, looked nervously at the face of the dead girl, could not help shuddering slightly, and involuntarily closed his eyes. What terrible and extraordinary beauty! He turned away and tried to go to one side, but the strange curiosity and peculiar fascination which men feel in moments of fear compelled him to look again and again, though with a similar shudder. And in truth, there was something terrible about the beauty of the dead girl. Perhaps she would not have inspired so much fear had she been less beautiful, but there was nothing ghastly or deathlike in the face, which wore rather an expression of life, and it seemed to the philosopher as though she were watching him from under her closed eyelids. He even thought he saw a tear roll from under the eyelash of her right eye, but when it was halfway down her cheek, he saw that it was a drop of blood. He quickly went into one of the stalls, opened his book, and began to read the prayers in a very loud voice in order to keep up his courage. His deep voice sounded strange to himself in the grave-like silence. It aroused no echo in the silent and desolate wooden walls of the church. "What is there to be afraid of?" he thought to himself. "She will not rise from her bier, since she fears God's word. She will remain quietly resting. Yes, and what sort of a Cossack should I be if I were afraid? The fact is, I have drunk a little too much. That is why I feel so queer. Let me take a pinch of snuff. It is really excellent, first-rate." At the same time, he cast a furtive glance over the pages of the prayer book towards the bier, and involuntarily he said to himself, "There. See, she is getting up. Her head is already above the edge of the coffin." But a death-like silence prevailed. The coffin was motionless, and all the candles shone steadily. It was an awe-inspiring sight, this church lit up at midnight, with the corpse in the midst, and no living soul near but one. The philosopher began to sing in various keys in order to stifle his fears, but every moment he glanced across at the coffin, and involuntarily the question came to his lips, suppose she rose up after all. But the coffin did not move. Nowhere was there the slightest sound nor stir. Not even did a cricket chirp in any corner. There was nothing audible but the slight sputtering of some distant candle or the faint fall of a drop of wax. Suppose she rose up after all. He raised his head. Then he looked round him wildly and rubbed his eyes. Yes, she was no longer lying in the coffin, but sitting upright. He turned away his eyes, but at once looked again, terrified at the coffin. She stood up, then she walked with closed eyes through the church, stretching out her arms as though she wanted to seize someone. She now came straight towards him. Full of alarm, he traced with his finger a circle round himself. Then, in a loud voice, he began to recite the prayers and formulas of exorcism which he had learnt from a monk who had often seen witches and evil spirits. She had almost reached the edge of the circle which he had traced, but it was evident that she had not the power to enter it. Her face wore a bluish tint like that of one who has been several days dead. Thomas had not the courage to look at her, so terrible was her appearance. Her teeth chattered, and she opened her dead eyes, but as in her rage she saw nothing, she turned in another direction and felt with outstretched arms among the pillars and corners of the church in the hope of seizing him. At last she stood still, made a threatening gesture, and then lay down again in the coffin. The philosopher could not recover his self-possession and kept on gazing anxiously at it. Suddenly it rose from its place and began hurtling about the church with a whizzing sound. At one time it was almost directly over his head, but the philosopher observed that it could not pass over the area of his charmed circle, so he kept on repeating his formulas of exorcism. The coffin now fell with a crash in the middle of the church and remained lying there motionless. The corpse rose again. It had now a greenish-blue color, but at the same moment the distant crowing of a cock was audible, and it lay down again. The philosopher's heart beat violently, and the perspiration poured in streams from his face, but heartened by the crowing of the cock, he rapidly repeated the prayers. As the first light of dawn looked through the windows, there came a deacon and the grey-haired Javtuk, who acted as sacristan, in order to release him. When he had reached the house, he could not sleep for a long time, but at last weariness overpowered him, and he slept till noon. When he awoke, his experiences of the night appeared to him like a dream. He was given a quart of brandy to strengthen him. At table he was again talkative, and ate a fairly large sucking pig almost without assistance. But none the less he resolved to say nothing of what he had seen, and to all curious questions only returned the answer, yes, some wonderful things happened. The philosopher was one of those men who, when they have had a good meal, are uncommonly amiable. He lay down on a bench, with his pipe in his mouth, looked blandly at all, and expectorated every minute. But as the evening approached, he became more and more pensive. About supper-time nearly, the whole company had assembled in order to play craply. This is a kind of game of skittles, in which, instead of bowls, long staves are used, and the winner has the right to ride on the back of his opponent. Provided the spectators with much amusement, sometimes the groom, a huge man, would clamber on the back of the swineherd, who was slim and short and shrunken. Another time the groom would present his own back, while Dorosh sprang on it shouting, "What a regular ox!" Those of the company who were more staid sat by the threshold of the kitchen. They looked uncommonly serious, smoked their pipes, and did not even smile when the younger ones went into fits of laughter over some joke of the groom or spirit. Thomas vainly attempted to take part in the game. A gloomy thought was firmly fixed like a nail in his head. In spite of his desperate efforts to appear cheerful after supper, fear had overmastered his whole being, and it increased with the growing darkness. "Now it is time for us to go, Mr. Student," said the grey-haired Cossack, and stood up with Dorosh. "Let us betake ourselves to our work." Thomas was conducted to the church in the same way as on the previous evening. Again he was left alone, and the door was bolted behind him. As soon as he found himself alone, he began to feel in the grip of his fears. He again saw the dark pictures of the saints in their gilt frames, and the black coffin, which stood menacing and silent in the middle of the church. "Never mind," he said to himself. "I am over the first shock. The first time I was frightened, but I am not so at all now, no, not at all." He quickly went into a stall, drew a circle round him with his finger, uttered some prayers and formulas for exorcism, and then began to read the prayers for the dead in a loud voice, and with the fixed resolution not to look up from the book nor take notice of anything. He did so for an hour and began to grow a little tired. He cleared his throat and drew his snuff-box out of his pocket, but before he had taken a pinch, he looked nervously towards the coffin. A sudden chill shot through him. The witch was already standing before him on the edge of the circle, and had fastened her green eyes upon him. He shuddered, looked down at the book, and began to read his prayers and exorcisms aloud. Yet all the while he was aware how her teeth chattered, and how she stretched out her arms to seize him. But when he cast a hasty glance towards her, he saw that she was not looking in his direction, and it was clear that she could not see him. Then she began to murmur in an undertone, and terrible words escaped her lips, words that sounded like the bubbling of boiling pitch. The philosopher did not know their meaning, but he knew that they signified something terrible and were intended to counteract his exorcisms. After she had spoken, a stormy wind arose in the church, and there was a noise like the rushing of many birds. He heard the noise of their wings and claws as they flapped against and scratched at the iron bars of the church windows. There were also violent blows on the church door, as if someone were trying to break it in pieces. The philosopher's heart beat violently. He did not dare to look up, but continued to read the prayers without a pause. At last there was heard in the distance the shrill sound of a cock's crow. The exhausted philosopher stopped and gave a great sigh of relief. Those who came to release him found him more dead than alive. He had leant his back against the wall and stood motionless, regarding them without any expression in his eyes. They were obliged almost to carry him to the house. He then shook himself, asked for, and drank a quart of brandy. He passed his hand through his hair and said, "There are all sorts of horrors in the world, and such dreadful things happen that—" Here he made a gesture as though to ward off something. All who heard him bent their heads forward in curiosity. Even a small boy, who ran on everyone's errands, stood by with his mouth wide open. Just then a young woman, in a close-fitting dress, passed by. She was the old cook's assistant, and very coquettish. She always stuck something in her bodice by way of ornament, a ribbon or a flower, or even a piece of paper if she could find nothing else. "Good day, Thomas," she said, as she saw the philosopher. "Dear me, what has happened to you?" she exclaimed, striking her hands together. "Well, what is it, you silly creature? Good heavens! You have grown quite grey." "Yes, so he has," said Spirit, regarding him more closely. "You have grown as grey as our old Javtuk." When the philosopher heard that, he hastened into the kitchen, where he had noticed on the wall a dirty, three-cornered piece of looking-glass. In front of it hung some forget-me-nots, evergreens, and a small garland, a proof that it was the toilette glass of the young coquette. With alarm he saw that it actually was as they had said. His hair was quite grizzled. He sank into a reverie. At last he said to himself, "I will go to the colonel, tell him all, and declare that I will read no more prayers. He must send me back at once to Kiev." With this intention, he turned towards the doorsteps of the colonel's house. The colonel was sitting motionless in his room. His face displayed the same hopeless grief which Thomas had observed on it on his first arrival, only the hollows in his cheeks had deepened. It was obvious that he took very little or no food. Strange paleness made him look almost as though made of marble. "Good day," he said, as he observed Thomas standing, cap in hand, at the door. "Well, how are you getting on?" "All right." "Yes, sir, all right. Such hellish things are going on that one would like to rush away as far as one's feet can carry one." "How so?" "Your daughter, sir. One considers the matter. She is, of course, of noble descent. No one can dispute that. But don't be angry, and may God grant her eternal rest." "Very well. What about her?" "She is in league with the devil. She inspires one with such dread that all prayers are useless." Pray. It was not for nothing that she sent for you. My dove was troubled about her salvation, and wished to expel all evil influences by means of prayer. I swear, gracious sir, it is beyond my power." Pray, continued the colonel in the same persuasive tone. "There is only one night more. You are doing a Christian work, and I will reward you richly." "However great your rewards may be, I will not read the prayers any more, sir," said Thomas in a tone of decision. "Listen, philosopher," said the colonel with a menacing air. "I will not allow any objections. In your seminary you may act as you like, but here it won't do. If I have you knouted, it will be somewhat different to the rector's canings. You know what a strong kanchuk too is." "Of course I do," said the philosopher in a low voice. "A number of them together are insupportable." Yes, I think so too. But you don't know yet how hot my fellows can make it, replied the colonel threateningly. He sprang up, and his face assumed a fierce, despotic expression, betraying the savagery of his nature, which had been only temporarily modified by grief. After the first flogging they pour on brandy, and then repeat it. Go away and finish your work. If you don't obey, you won't be able to stand again, and if you do, you will get 1,000 ducats. That is a devil of a fellow, thought the philosopher to himself, and went out. One can't trifle with him. But wait a little, my friend, I will escape you so cleverly that even your hounds can't find me. He determined, under any circumstances, to run away, and only waited till the hour after dinner arrived, when all the servants were accustomed to take a nap on the hay in the barn, and to snore and puff so loudly that it sounded as if machinery had been set up there. At last the time came. Even Javtouch stretched himself out in the sun and closed his eyes. Tremblingly and on tiptoe, the philosopher stole softly into the garden, whence he thought he could escape more easily into the open country. This garden was generally so choked up with weeds that it seemed admirably adapted for such an attempt. With the exception of a single path used by the people of the house, the whole of it was covered with cherry trees, elder bushes, and tall heath thistles with fibrous red buds. All these trees and bushes had been thickly overgrown with ivy, which formed a kind of roof. Its tendrils reached to the hedge and fell down on the other side in snake-like curves among the small, wild field flowers. Behind the hedge which bordered the garden was a dense mass of wild heather, in which it did not seem probable that anyone would care to venture himself, and the strong, stubborn stems of which seemed likely to baffle any attempt to cut them. As the philosopher was about to climb over the hedge, his teeth chattered, and his heart beat so violently that he felt frightened at it. The skirts of his long cloak seemed to cling to the ground, as though they had been fastened to it by pegs. When he had actually got over the hedge, he seemed to hear a shrill voice crying behind him, "Whither? Whither?" He jumped into the heather and began to run, stumbling over old roots and treading on unfortunate moles. When he had emerged from the heather, he saw that he still had a wide field to cross, behind which was a thick, thorny underwood. This, according to his calculation, must stretch as far as the road leading to Kiev, and if he reached it, he would be safe. Accordingly, he ran over the field and plunged into the thorny copse. Every sharp thorn he encountered tore a fragment from his coat. Then he reached a small open space. In the center of it stood a willow, whose branches hung down to the earth, and close by flowed a clear spring bright as silver. First thing the philosopher did was to lie down and drink eagerly, for he was intolerably thirsty. "Splendid water," he said, wiping his mouth. "This is a good place to rest in." "No, better run farther. Perhaps we are being followed," said a voice immediately behind him. Thomas started and turned. Before him stood Javtouch. "This devil of a Javtouch," he thought. "I should like to seize him by the feet and smash his hangdog face against the trunk of a tree." "Why did you go round such a long way?" continued Javtouch. "You had much better have chosen the path by which I came. It leads directly by the stable. Besides, it is a pity about your coat. Such splendid cloth. How much did it cost an ell?" "Well, we have had a long enough walk. It is time to go home." The philosopher followed Javtouch in a very depressed state. "Now the accursed witch will attack me in earnest," he thought. "But what have I really to fear? Am I not a Cossack? I have read the prayers for 2 nights already. With God's help, I will get through the 3rd night also. It is plain that the witch must have a terrible load of guilt upon her, else the evil one would not help her so much." Feeling somewhat encouraged by these reflections, he returned to the courtyard and asked Dorosh, who sometimes, by the steward's permission, had access to the wine cellar, to fetch him a small bottle of brandy. The 2 friends sat down before a barn and drank a pretty large one. Suddenly, the philosopher jumped up and said, "I want musicians. Bring some musicians." But without waiting for them, he began to dance the tropak in the courtyard. He danced till tea time, and the servants, who, as is usual in such cases, had formed a small circle round him, grew at last tired of watching him and went away saying, "By heavens, the man can dance." Finally, the philosopher lay down in the place where he had been dancing and fell asleep. It was necessary to pour a bucket of cold water on his head to wake him up for supper. At the meal he enlarged on the topic of what a Cossack ought to be and how he should not be afraid of anything in the world. "It is time," said Javtouch, "let us go." "I wish I could put a lighted match to your tongue," thought the philosopher. Then he stood up and said, "Let us go." On their way to the church, the philosopher kept looking round him on all sides and tried to start a conversation with his companions, but both Javtouch and Dorosh remained silent. It was a weird night. In the distance, wolves howled continually, and even the barking of the dogs had something unearthly about it. "That doesn't sound like wolves howling, but something else," remarked Dorosh. Javtuch still kept silence, and the philosopher did not know what answer to make. They reached the church and walked over the old wooden planks, whose rotten condition showed how little the lord of the manor cared about God and his soul. Javtuch and Dorosh left the philosopher alone, as on the previous evenings. There was still the same atmosphere of menacing silence in the church, in the center of which stood the coffin with the terrible witch inside it. "I am not afraid, by heavens, I am not afraid," he said, and after drawing a circle round himself as before, he began to read the prayers and exorcisms. An oppressive silence prevailed. The flickering candles filled the church with their clear light. The philosopher turned one page after another and noticed that he was not reading what was in the book. Full of alarm, he crossed himself and began to sing a hymn. This calmed him somewhat, and he resumed his reading, turning the pages rapidly as he did so. Suddenly, in the midst of the sepulchral silence, the iron lid of the coffin sprang open with a jarring noise, and the dead witch stood up. She was this time still more terrible in aspect than at first. Her teeth chattered loudly, and her lips, through which poured a stream of dreadful curses, moved convulsively. A whirlwind arose in the church. The icons of the saints fell on the ground, together with the broken window panes. The door was wrenched from its hinges, and a huge mass of monstrous creatures rushed into the church, which became filled with the noise of beating wings and scratching claws. All these creatures flew and crept about, seeking for the philosopher, from whose brain the last fumes of intoxication had vanished. He crossed himself ceaselessly and uttered prayer after prayer, hearing all the time the whole unclean swarm rustling about him and brushing him with the tips of their wings. He had not the courage to look at them. He only saw one uncouth monster standing by the wall, with long, shaggy hair and two flaming eyes. Over him something hung in the air which looked like a gigantic bladder, covered with countless crabs' claws and scorpions' stings, and with black clods of earth hanging from it. All these monsters stared about seeking him, but they could not find him, since he was protected by his sacred circle. "Bring the V! Bring the V!" cried the witch. Sudden silence followed. The howling of wolves was heard in the distance, and soon heavy footsteps resounded through the church. Thomas looked up furtively and saw that an ungainly human figure with crooked legs was being led into the church. He was quite covered with black soil, and his hands and feet resembled knotted roots. He trod heavily and stumbled at every step. His eyelids were of enormous length. With terror, Thomas saw that his face was of iron. They led him in by the arms and placed him near Thomas's circle. "Raise my eyelids." "I can't see anything," said the V in a dull, hollow voice, and they all hastened to help in doing so. "Don't look," an inner voice warned the philosopher, but he could not restrain from looking. "There he is," exclaimed the V, pointing an iron finger at him, and all the monsters rushed on him at once. Struck dumb with terror, he sank to the ground and died. At that moment, there sounded a cock's crow for the second time. The earth spirits had not heard the first one. In alarm, they hurried to the windows and the door to get out as quickly as possible. But it was too late. They all remained hanging as though fastened to the door and the windows. When the priest came, he stood amazed, such a desecration of God's house, and did not venture to read prayers there. The church remained standing as it was, with the monsters hanging on the windows and the door. Gradually it became overgrown with creepers, bushes, and wild heather, and no one can discover it now. When the report of this event reached Kiev, and the theologian Karlava heard what a fate had overtaken the philosopher Thomas, he sank for a whole hour into deep reflection. He had greatly altered of late. After finishing his studies, he had become bell-ringer of one of the chief churches in the city, and he always appeared with a bruised nose because the belfry staircase was in a ruinous condition. "Have you heard what has happened to Thomas?" said Tiberius Gorobitz, who had become a philosopher and now wore a moustache. "Yes, God had appointed it so," answered the bell-ringer. "Let us go to the ale-house. We will drink a glass to his memory." The young philosopher, who, with the enthusiasm of a novice, had made such full use of his privileges as a student that his breeches and coat, and even his cap reeked of brandy and tobacco, agreed readily to the proposal. "He was a fine fellow, Thomas," said the bell-ringer, as the limping innkeeper set the third jug of beer before him. "A splendid fellow, and lost his life for nothing." "I know why he perished," said Gorobitz, "because he was afraid. If he had not feared her, the witch could have done nothing to him. One ought to cross oneself incessantly and spit exactly on her tail, and then not the least harm can happen. I know all about it, for here in Kiev, All the old women in the marketplace are witches." The bell ringer nodded assent. Being aware that he could not say any more, he got up cautiously and went out, swaying to the right and left in order to find a hiding place in the thick steppe grass outside the town. At the same time, in accordance with his old habits, he did not forget to steal an old boot sole which lay on the alehouse bench. The end.